The impact shook her entire body. Sarah Quinn braced herself against the restraints as the exploration vessel howled through Glaciaron 4's atmosphere, shuddering under the pressure of atmospheric drag and turbulent wind currents. The hull creaked like a dying beast. Panels sparked overhead, showering the cabin with brief bursts of blue light before the backup systems kicked in. Across the cockpit, Commander Thalen's exoskeletal fingers gripped the control sphere, his voice sharp and clipped as he shouted commands in a dialect most of the crew couldn't even translate. Glaciaron 4 had been marked as a frozen exoplanet, catalogued for its subterranean crystal caverns and unusual magnetic fields. The team had been dispatched to survey potential mining zones for cryo-ice deposits. It was supposed to be routine, controlled descent, 2-week operation, quick extraction, but when the vessel hit an electromagnetic pocket, the navigation system collapsed instantly. The guidance arrays failed. No one expected to be flying blind into an avalanche of razor-sharp ice spires. The ship clipped the edge of a mountain ridge. The front thrusters sputtered and died. The pilot, a Sornian with twitching antennae and poor tolerance for adrenaline, screamed just before the vessel skidded across the glacial basin and smashed into an icy ridge. Metal screamed. The world turned upside down. Then it all went quiet. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was upside down, the harness cutting into her ribs. Her ears rang, and for a few seconds, she thought she was still falling. It wasn't until a chunk of frozen dirt fell across her helmet that she realized the ship had stopped. Slowly, painfully, she unlatched herself, crashing awkwardly to the floor. Her wrist throbbed. Blood trickled from her hairline. But she was alive. The crash site was a mess. One wing had been torn completely off. The main support beam had split the cargo bay open like a crushed can. Sharp, jagged columns of ice now jutted through the broken floor, glowing faintly in the dim planetary light. Commander Thalen was already on his feet, shouting in his deep, vibrating voice at the remaining crew. Beside him, Specialist Dren, an aquatic species with translucent skin and wide black eyes, clutched his equipment bag, trembling. The other two, Kriv and Raln, scrambled to salvage supplies from the wreckage. Their suits, though intact, were not designed for this kind of raw exposure. Only Sarah had thermal insulation rated for Earth's Himalayan expeditions. The irony wasn't lost on her. "We need shelter," Commander Thalen barked, gesturing toward the ice cliffs ahead. "This ship won't hold once night sets in." Sarah didn't argue. Already the temperature was falling. Her breath fogged up inside her visor. The alien sun hung low on the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the icy wasteland. Visibility was dropping. If they didn't move now, the storm building in the distance would bury the vessel in minutes. The group moved quickly. Sarah took point, relying on her mountaineering experience. She spotted a series of jagged cracks in the canyon wall, cave mouths partially buried beneath frost and snow. With some effort, she cleared a path. The others followed, dragging equipment, wounded limbs, and fractured egos behind them. Snow began to fall, first in gentle flakes, then in thick, blinding sheets. The wind howled. The caves were no longer an option. They were the only hope of survival. Inside the cavern, the temperature was even colder. The walls shimmered with embedded crystals, their surfaces reflecting faint light in icy hues. The ceiling dripped with slow-moving icicles, long as spears. The entrance was narrow, but the interior opened into a hollowed chamber roughly the size of a cargo container. It was dry, mostly shielded from the wind, and most importantly, defensible. Thalen called it adequate. Sarah called it better than a coffin. They set down what little equipment had survived the crash. The emergency beacon had been crushed. The portable reactor was cracked and useless. Worse, the bioheater module had been ripped out completely during descent. No heat, no light, no power. Dren ran diagnostics on the few remaining tools, but shook his head after a minute. His kind wasn't built for this kind of cold. His body, adapted to aquatic environments, was already beginning to stiffen. "We're going to freeze," Kriv muttered, wrapping her multiple arms around her core. Her breath crystallized in the air. "No," Sarah said quietly. "We're going to survive." The aliens glanced at her. None of them said anything, but she saw it in their posture, in the way Thalen turned away and in the nervous tapping of Raln's clawed foot. They didn't believe her. To them, she was just a human with limited tools and no advanced neural enhancements. Useful on Earth, perhaps, but here, just another liability. Sarah sat against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. Her fingers felt like they were being stabbed with needles. She reached into her survival pack, which had somehow stayed intact. Inside, a steel multi-tool, rope, insulation foam, flint, a dry thermal blanket, and a tiny survival manual so old it was printed on actual paper. She smiled bitterly. No laser cutters, no plasma torch, just earth-born stubbornness. She glanced around. The cave was filled with possibilities, if one knew how to look. Shattered crate wood, broken insulation lining, fragments of carbon polymer that could act as kindling. She picked up 2 sticks from the crate wreckage, inspecting their density. Dry enough. Maybe. If she could just create friction fast enough. The aliens were huddled in the far corner, watching her with a mix of curiosity and doubt. She ignored them and began working. She stripped fibers from the insulation, rolling them into a tight ball for tinder. Then she took the wooden pieces, braced one with her boot, and started sliding the other against it in quick, sharp motions. "Is she trying to make fire?" Dren whispered, barely able to speak from the cold. Thalen didn't respond. His breath had slowed, his thick armor provided some protection, but even his kind had limits. Kriv's skin was beginning to pale into a bluish hue. Raun was shaking violently. Sarah's arms burned, her hands were numb, but she kept going, again and again. Sparks flew and fizzled out. Smoke, she saw it, just a wisp. Then it was gone. She repositioned the wood, scraped again. Time blurred, her body screamed. She focused harder. It was like training on the mountain passes in Nepal all over again. There, too, she had been called reckless for relying on primitive techniques. Another spark, more smoke, then finally, a flicker. She leaned in, gently blowing into the tinder nest. The ember caught. The fiber glowed orange. She cupped it like it was gold, feeding it carefully with slivers of wood and polymer strips. The flame grew. One by one, the aliens turned to look, not out of mockery this time, but awe. A small fire, crackling gently, casting shadows on the ice. Real, ancient fire. Not simulated heat, not synthetic warmth. Just friction, patience, and willpower. Sarah didn't speak. She just added another piece of wood and sat down beside it, feeling life return to her fingers. The others gathered around silently, no one daring to speak. For the first time since the crash, the cold retreated. And in that quiet, flickering moment, the human was no longer just an extra crew member. She was the reason they would survive the night. By the time the cave had filled with the soft, golden glow of firelight, Sarah's arms were trembling from fatigue. She stretched her fingers near the flame, careful not to scorch her gloves, then leaned back and observed the crew. The fire had pulled them in like insects to warmth. No one spoke. Raun had stopped shivering. Kriv's jaw finally relaxed. Even Dren's translucent skin had started to regain some of its natural pigmentation. Commander Thalen stood apart from the others, his face unreadable under the rigid plates of his helmet. His kind had no facial muscles for expression, but the way he remained unmoving with his arms crossed said everything. He wasn't angry. He was reevaluating. Sarah removed one glove slowly and held her palm close to the heat. The sensation stung at first, then ebbed into something close to comfort. Her wrist still ached from the fall, and she knew bruises covered most of her left side. She ignored the pain. What mattered now was staying warm and staying alive. She let herself rest for no more than 10 minutes before sitting up and pulling her pack toward her. One problem was solved. The next one was water. She glanced toward the cave wall. Pale ice lined every surface, glimmering softly. It was thick, layered over centuries, probably clean, but frozen solid. Eating it would sap heat from the body. Drinking it as ice was suicide. It needed to be melted, boiled, ideally. That meant a container and a stable flame. She sorted through the broken supplies again and found a carbon-reinforced dish, dented but intact from one of the emergency ration kits. Good enough. She scraped off a chunk of ice from the wall, careful not to dull her blade. It cracked off in a clean piece, and she placed it in the dish, then positioned the dish over the edge of the fire using a bent metal strut as a support. Improvised, but steady. The ice began to sweat, then melt. Drops hissed and evaporated on the hot metal. Sarah adjusted the angle. Within minutes, a thin layer of clean water collected in the dish. She pulled out a heat-insulated ration bag and poured the water in. Not enough for all of them, not yet, but it was a start. Kriv watched her with unblinking eyes. The alien's voice came slow, accented, uncertain. "You learned this where?" Sarah looked up. "Earth. Mountain training in Nepal. Cold air, low tech, no margin for error. Same rules apply here." Kriv tilted her head, visibly confused. "No tech?" "No advanced tech," Sarah corrected. "Just hands, tools, and a little time." Dren approached slowly. He crouched beside the dish and looked into it as if peering into a chemical reaction he didn't understand. "You did this with friction." "Yes," Sarah replied. "It's basic physics." He didn't respond. His black eyes flicked toward the small stack of wood she had prepared next to the fire. "What happens when the material is gone?" "We adapt again," she said, her tone calm. "But one thing at a time." Commander Thalen stepped forward. His heavy boots cracked the ice beneath him. He crouched beside the flame and picked up one of the unused sticks, turning it over in his three-fingered hand. "Your world encourages this kind of thinking?" "It encourages survival," Sarah said. "The rest you learn because you have to." Thalen examined the stick for another moment, then set it down without a word and walked back to the edge of the cave. He stood silently, eyes locked on the storm outside. Sarah followed his gaze. The snowfall had slowed, but the wind still howled beyond the narrow opening. The ridgeline that once marked their crash site was buried beneath a pale sheet of white. The ship's twisted metal hull barely peeked out from beneath a drift. If help was coming, it wasn't coming soon. Raln came next. His kind moved like mantises, quick, precise, but always watching. He squatted beside the fire and said nothing, simply staring into the flames. Sarah handed him the ration bag with the warm water. He took it slowly, sniffed it, then drank in small, controlled sips. His eyelids fluttered once, which Sarah assumed was a good sign. She returned to her task. More ice. More melted water. She worked methodically, breaking off chunks and rotating the heating dish so no one spot overheated and cracked. The others followed her lead. Kriv tried to copy her movements, fumbling with her thicker digits. Dren assisted her by holding the insulation fibers while she scraped. Raln used a bit of hull plating to carve a shallow bowl. For a moment, they were no longer a fractured, panicked team of survivors. They were cooperating. It was only when Sarah stood to stretch that she noticed her legs had gone numb. The adrenaline had masked the chill, but it was creeping in again. She grabbed the emergency blanket from her pack and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. The fire helped, but it wasn't enough for the long haul. They needed insulation, something to trap heat, cover the cave floor, and block the incoming draft from the tunnel. She scanned the perimeter of the cave. There were slabs of ice wedged into the side wall, dense, clear, and likely cold enough to be cut without immediate melting. If she could stack those near the entrance and reinforce the outer edges with the remains of their gear. She looked back at the team. "We need to build a barrier near the cave mouth. Ice blocks, gear, whatever we can move. We keep this heat in or we freeze again." Commander Thalen nodded once, the first sign of unspoken approval. Kriv stood up and cracked her arms, which had finally stopped trembling. "Where do we start?" Sarah pointed to the nearest wall. "Start there. Stack flat pieces like bricks. Angle them inward. Dren, use those suit fragments for patching the seams. Raln, help me move the crate halves." They moved as one, clumsy at first, but growing more confident with each minute. Sarah worked beside them, lifting, placing, checking the fire as it flickered and rose. The barrier grew, uneven, imperfect, but real. The wind began to dull behind the half wall. The temperature stopped dropping, and somewhere in the midst of that frantic construction, something subtle changed. The aliens no longer looked at her with skepticism. They listened when she gave instructions. They followed without hesitation. No one said it aloud, but the power dynamic had shifted. Hours passed. The fire was fed carefully, sparingly. The water ration grew with every melted dish. The crude barrier sealed out more cold than expected. And when the wind finally died to a whisper outside the ice walls and the snow settled under a sky streaked with green auroras, Sarah sat back, wiped her forehead, and closed her eyes. She had started the day as the outsider, the human with primitive training. Now she was the reason the entire team could sleep without fearing death in the dark. She didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She simply rested, knowing tomorrow would bring new problems and she'd face those too. The fire crackled on. Sarah awoke to silence. Not the fragile quiet of sleep, but the heavy stillness of survival. Her body ached, especially her shoulders and forearms, still sore from the hours of friction that had ignited the fire. She didn't remember falling asleep. She must have passed out sitting upright, still clutching the emergency blanket across her chest. The fire had dimmed to a bed of glowing coals, flickering softly in the hollow, casting red-orange shadows that danced lazily across the crystalline cave walls. She stirred carefully, trying not to jostle her sore muscles. The others were asleep. Raun lay closest to the fire, curled into a defensive coil. His carapace shimmered faintly, reflecting the light in fractured blues. Dren had positioned himself near the melted water reserve, wrapped tightly in a shredded thermal tarp. Kriv, arms folded, leaned against the wall with her breathing deep and slow, though the frost still clung to the tips of her limbs. Commander Thalen stood at the entrance, unmoving, as if frozen in place. But Sarah could see the soft rise and fall of his chest beneath the armor and the occasional flick of his jaw muscle. He was awake, watching. Sarah stood up and stretched, her joints cracking. The cold pressed in gently now, no longer threatening but never fully gone. She approached the embers and added a few strips of dry packing material. The fire flared weakly, enough to warm the cave again. Then she crouched and checked the dish she had left over the coals, half full with melted water, still warm. She poured it into a second ration bag and sealed it tightly. Thalen turned his head when he heard her movements. His eyes, deep-set and luminous, watched her silently. She approached him. "We have enough water to last a few more hours," she said. "We'll need to melt more before dusk." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared through the icy gap at the cave's entrance. Outside, the snow had mostly stopped. Thick drifts blanketed the ridge. A faint glow on the horizon suggested morning, though Glacier 4's days were long and uneven. After a moment, he finally spoke. "You were not chosen for your rank," he said flatly. "You were assigned to this team by rotation. Random." Sarah nodded. "That's right. You've demonstrated more command instinct in 20 hours than some officers show in decades," he said. "Yet you gave no orders. You simply acted." She didn't know if that was praise or an observation. She accepted it either way. "I don't care about protocol. I care about staying alive." Thalen exhaled through his nostrils. "Your instincts are disruptive." "I'll take that as a compliment." He didn't smile. His species couldn't, but his tone softened. "We wouldn't have made it through the night." Sarah looked back toward the others. "We're not through it yet." Dren stirred, groaning softly as he sat up. His face had lost the gray pallor it had before, but he still looked exhausted. He reached for the warmed ration bag Sarah had prepared and drank slowly. "My extremities still hurt," he muttered. "But I think I can move again." Kriv opened one eye and grunted. "That's because she boiled you back to life, fishhead." Dren made a noise of disapproval but said nothing. Sarah didn't intervene. The banter was a good sign. It meant their spirits were recovering. Physical damage was one thing, but despair was deadlier in the long run. Raun sat up next, stretching his limbs carefully. "The signal beacon is useless," he said. "Even if I rebuilt the casing, the energy coil is ruptured. No chance of long-range transmission." Sarah turned to Thalen. "You said before the storm that the electromagnetic field here interferes with most forms of tech." He nodded. "It causes discharges. Anything unshielded is vulnerable." Sarah tapped her chin. "What about short-range analog signaling? Something basic, pulse-based, like Morse?" Thalen considered that. "We'd still need a transmitter that doesn't rely on fusion or quantum triggers." Raun's mandibles twitched. "I might be able to rig something if I use the sound coils from the navigation console and rewire them to pulse frequency instead of tone. It would need a manual operator." "I'll do it," Sarah said instantly. "I don't need translation software." Kriv grunted. "Of course you know that too." Sarah smiled faintly. "Some of us still teach it on Earth. It's a fallback skill." The team began working. The fire had lifted something heavy from all of them, as if proving that one small success gave permission to believe in more. Raun scavenged components from the wrecked gear they had salvaged, laying them out on a spare thermal blanket like a surgeon preparing instruments. Sarah assisted him, using her multi-tool to slice wires, strip casings, and rebend metal contact points. Dren helped by mapping the output pattern from memory, translating it into rhythmic intervals. Kriv, despite her size, handled the microcircuits with surprisingly steady precision. Thalin didn't take command. He didn't need to. For now, the group operated around Sarah not because of rank, but trust. The others deferred to her without question, and she navigated that unspoken leadership carefully, never overstepping, always inviting contribution. Hours passed. The transmitter prototype took shape. The fire was kept alive with careful rotation. Sarah had shown the others how to maintain it, and now Raln took quiet pride in feeding it. Dren began experimenting with melting ice in other containers, eager to increase their water stores. The alien scientist, who had once ridiculed her primitive tools, now held a steel cup over the flames with reverence. When the transmitter was finally ready, Raln handed her the wired signal paddle. "This will only carry through the upper ridge for about 5 kilometers, he warned. "It's not real communication, just a pulse." "It's enough," Sarah said, "as long as someone's listening." She tapped out a basic rescue pattern: 6 short pulses, pause, 3 long pause, 6 short again. A makeshift SOS repeated every 5 seconds. The soft whine of pulsing energy filled the cave. Kriv leaned back and exhaled. "You know what's funny?" Sarah turned to her. "What? You came here with no implants, no neural links, no embedded protocols. And now we're surviving because you scraped 2 sticks together and made fire." Sarah chuckled. "I think that says more about your tech than my methods." Dren looked up from his melted water ration. "I believe it says something about balance," he said softly. "Advanced knowledge fails when we forget where it came from." Thalin approached and stood next to Sarah. He looked at the transmitter, then the fire, then her. "When we return," he said, "I will include your name in the after-action report, in full." Sarah blinked. "That's not necessary." "It is," he replied. "Your leadership was not protocol, but it was correct." For the first time, she saw something change in his eyes, something rigid breaking just slightly. Not quite warmth, but respect, hard-earned and freely given. She nodded once. "Then include the fire, too." Thalen said nothing more. The pulse continued in the background. The fire crackled gently, and in the frozen silence of Glaciaron 4, a human, armed with nothing but stubbornness, scars, and friction, had changed the fate of a team that had nearly given up. And she wasn't done yet. The signal pulse continued in steady rhythm, a quiet thrum in the background like a heartbeat. Sarah's fingers moved with practiced consistency as she tapped out the sequence, pausing only to let the improvised device cool. Her wrist was sore again, the tendons stretched from tension and repeated motion. The glow of the fire softened the cave's edges, casting long shadows on the makeshift ice wall and flickering against the faces of her companions. The stillness was no longer oppressive. It had become something else, waiting. Kriv was the first to break the silence. She stood abruptly, muttering something in her native dialect before pacing toward the cave entrance. Her 4 arms folded and unfolded across her chest in agitation. She paused near Thalen, who remained unmoving as always, then spun and walked toward Sarah. "Commander or not, I want to say something," Kriv muttered. "I can't sit here stewing in it anymore." Sarah stopped tapping and looked up. "Go ahead." Kriv crouched near the fire, her large frame dimming part of the light. "I was born in orbit," she said. "Raised on a mining station. Nothing ever broke down, not really. If it did, tech fixed it. Autopatcher nanobot weave, resynthesis matrix. You needed water, you programmed the reclamation unit. You needed food, you printed it. Even fire. Fire was for rituals or for containment breaches, not for heat." She picked up a thin splinter of polymer and tossed it into the flames. "You came in with nothing but a bag of scraps and somehow saved us all. We mocked you for being primitive, but you were the only one who knew what to do when everything went dark." Sarah said nothing. She waited. Kriv's lower arms tensed. "It makes me feel stupid, weak." Sarah leaned forward. "It should make you feel aware," she said softly. "You have strengths I don't. I couldn't rebuild a trans relay from shattered parts. I couldn't decipher half the things Raln's doing with that console. But I've learned to survive in places that don't care what species you are or what tech you carry, places where instinct matters more than credentials." Kriv's jaw tightened, then relaxed. "You're not what I expected from a Death Worlder." Sarah smirked faintly. "I get that a lot." Behind her, Dren added his voice. "My species evolved underwater. We build with coral and glass. Fire is considered dangerous, a tool of destruction. I never saw it as something beautiful until now." Raln didn't speak. He remained hunched over the transmitter, adjusting its resonance loop with small, precise movements. But the slight lift of his antennae suggested he was listening closely. Thalen turned finally, his armored feet crunching softly on the frosted stone. "There is shame in overconfidence," he said, "but no shame in learning. This mission was designed to test our adaptability. Perhaps this is what the test truly was." Sarah resumed the pulse transmission, her mind drifting to something quieter, something deeper than the cold. She thought of her father, who had taught her to build fires in the woods of Colorado, using nothing but friction and stubbornness. He had said once, "If you can make fire from nothing, you'll never be powerless." She hadn't understood him at the time. Now she did. The afternoon wore on. The storm outside eased, leaving behind only a moaning wind that crept around the imperfect edges of the ice barrier. The transmitter continued its slow rhythm. Thalen took a shift at the signal paddle, allowing Sarah to rest. Raln set up a rotating water-melting station using scavenged fuel plates and improvised brackets. Dren mapped the internal cave structure, searching for deeper, insulated chambers in case temperatures dropped again. Kriv gathered more kindling from supply wreckage at the edge of the cave's outer wall. Each of them worked, not because they had been ordered to, but because survival was no longer Sarah's job alone. The burden had been shared. Leadership had become collective. As dusk approached, the light outside shifted from harsh white to bluish gray. The temperature dropped again, but not as fast. Inside the cave, warmth lingered. Sarah sat quietly near the fire, staring into its glow, her body aching, but her mind alert. Kriv returned with another armful of materials. She dropped them near the fire and stood. "We need more light for the inner cave. The fire's enough here, but it doesn't reach past the bend." Sarah nodded and stood. "We'll use ember trays." She explained the method. Metal dishes packed with embers, insulated with foam around the base to prevent heat loss. Movable, contained. Raln assisted in setting up 2 trays, one of which he carried deeper into the cavern. The light spread, bouncing off the crystals embedded in the walls, illuminating a passage that dipped downward into an echoing gallery of ice columns. Kriv followed, testing the air for drafts. "Still stable," she said. "It's dry and enclosed." "We can sleep there," Sarah said. "Rotate watch near the fire, conserve energy." Dren wandered in next, cradling a second water pouch. "Oxygen levels seem stable. I think the upper chambers ventilate indirectly through the outer ridgeline." Thalen entered last. He moved slowly, deliberately inspecting the walls and ceiling. "This area is safe for the night," he confirmed. They returned to the main chamber just as the last pale glow of the sky faded. Sarah added fuel to the fire, then crouched to inspect the remaining rations, enough for another 36 hours, if carefully distributed. She took the smallest portion and began heating it over the flames. As the fire hissed softly, Kriv sat beside her. "Your people still live like this, don't they?" "In some places." Sarah stirred the contents of the bag. "Some do. Some have no choice. Others choose it, out of tradition or pride." "I always thought it was savage," Kriv admitted. "Now?" Sarah asked. Kriv was silent for a long moment. "Now I think it's wise. Maybe wiser than anything we've built." The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks upward. One landed near Thalen's boot. He didn't move. His eyes remained locked on the flames. "I was raised to believe Deathworlders were chaos incarnate," he said. "Unpredictable, volatile, a last resort in crisis, but never primary strategy. That assumption was flawed." "You don't need to explain," Sarah said quietly. "But I will," he replied. "Because I must. I will report what happened here. I will tell Command that the only reason this team endured is because one human refused to wait for rescue, and because fire, literal fire, was what saved us when technology failed." Sarah stared at the flame. "Just make sure it's not rewritten by someone in an office who's never felt cold." Thalen's voice was steady. "I'll make sure." Raln returned from the inner cave with a nod. The ember trays are holding. We can rotate sleep now. I'll take first watch. Sarah didn't argue. Her body screamed for rest. She took a moment to drink from the warm pouch, nodded to Kriv, and headed into the deeper chamber. As she lay down on the insulated surface, she heard the steady rhythm of the signal pulse continuing, a slow heartbeat against the silence. Not just a call for help, but a message. We are alive. And they were. Not because of gear or protocols or contingency plans, but because she had brought something older than any of those things. Because she had brought fire. Sarah awoke to a distant, rhythmic hum, low, steady, and mechanical. It wasn't the pulse of the transmitter. This sound had weight. It pressed faintly against the bones of her skull, vibrating like an approaching engine muffled by ice and snow. Her instincts snapped into focus, and she sat up instantly. The ember tray still glowed near her boots, but the heat had faded. Her breath fogged in the chilled air as she stood and crossed the narrow bend leading back to the main chamber. Raln stood near the entrance, antennae lifted, his long fingers resting on the wall of ice as if listening through it. When she approached, he turned his head slightly but said nothing. The sound continued, now clearer, a low-frequency rumble rising in short intervals. Not wind, not tectonic movement, it was deliberate. "Signal response?" Sarah asked, her voice raw with sleep. Raln nodded once. "Rescue shuttle," he said quietly. "Vertical thrusters breaking descent." Her heart jumped, not with excitement, but with tension. Everything she had held together for the last 2 days now strained all at once. The fire, the transmitter, the water, the barrier, her hands, her voice, her judgment. She had led, she had endured, and now someone was coming, someone who might rewrite the story. Kriv stirred first, then Dren, then Thalin. The commander's movement was slower than usual, more deliberate, as if he too recognized that the most fragile part of survival wasn't always the cold. It was the return to order afterward. Sarah moved to the transmitter and switched it off. "They won't need the beacon anymore," she said. Dren rubbed his eyes. "Did they say how long?" Raln checked the coil. "No verbal contact yet, but at this distance, 4 minutes, maybe 5. Kriv exhaled through her teeth. "Just enough time to clean ourselves up and pretend we didn't nearly die." Thalen remained near the wall. His gaze remained fixed forward. "No one will pretend," he said. "Not this time." The cave came alive with quiet activity. Raln folded the transmitter's components into a neat packet. Dren secured the remaining ration bags. Kriv helped Sarah gently collapse the ice wall to clear the shuttle's landing path. The morning light streamed in now, white, sharp, almost painful after days of cold blue dimness. Snow flurries blew across the cave mouth, catching the light like scattered crystals. And then it appeared. A shadow fell over the cave. A twin-engine atmospheric shuttle descended in controlled bursts, its retro thrusters melting a divot into the snowpack below. The hull bore the seal of the expedition's charter authority, 3 golden stars over a sphere. The rear hatch hissed open before the skids even locked into place. 2 suited officers disembarked, weapons holstered but visible, helmets mirrored. The one on the left scanned the group. The one on the right raised a gloved hand and tapped a comm panel. "Commander Thalin, Crew Alpha 8, identification confirmed," the voice came through a vocoder. "Rescue initiated." Thalen stepped forward, his posture formal. "Acknowledged," he replied. "This cave is stable. Fire-based heat system established. Survivors are accounted for." The lead officer's helmet tilted slightly at the word fire, but he didn't question it. Instead, he held up a scanning wand and began passing it over each member of the team. Sarah stood still as the soft blue light traced her chest and arms. "No neural implants," the officer observed. "Manual body heat management." Friction burns detected on hands. "She made fire," Kriv muttered. The officer paused. "Fire?" "With sticks," Dren added, smiling faintly. The officer didn't respond. He moved to Thalin. "Commander, we'll require a full report upon return to orbit." "You'll have it," Thalin said. Sarah felt a weight shift, not from exhaustion, though that clung to her like wet cloth, but from awareness. This was the moment where everything would be framed, not by her but by others. Clean uniforms, operational directives, standard language. She looked down at her hands. Blisters had formed where the skin had been rubbed raw. Her nails were chipped, her fingertips blackened from soot and flame. Proof. Kriv stepped beside her. "Don't let them take credit." "I won't," Sarah replied. The officer gestured toward the ramp. "Let's move. Storm cell reforming in upper stratosphere. Departure window is limited." The team followed. Sarah took one last look at the fire pit. Embers still pulsed in the stone bowl. A small flame lingered, stubborn, slow. She crouched and covered it with a flat stone, not to extinguish it, but to preserve it. The shuttle lifted off 10 minutes later. Inside, medical drones scanned for exposure damage. Rations were distributed. Standard protocol unfolded around them like a pre-programmed play. No one acknowledged the quiet silence of the humans. No one asked how fire had replaced tech. It wasn't the time. The debrief came 6 hours later in a sterile white hall aboard the research vessel Corthan's Reach. Commander Thalen stood before the Board of Inquiry, 3 senior officers, none of whom had ever set foot on Glaciron 4. He spoke in measured tones. "The electromagnetic field disabled most of our systems. Atmospheric pressure ruptured the heater unit. Survival time was projected under 16 hours. The senior official interrupted. "Yet your entire team was recovered alive after 48. How?" Thalen replied without hesitation. "Because Lieutenant Quinn reintroduced methods that require no infrastructure. She made fire from friction, boiled ice, stabilized morale, led defense efforts, rotated sleep shifts. No panic was permitted." "Are you saying she assumed command?" "No," Thalen said. "I'm saying command was irrelevant. She acted, and we followed." The board was silent for a moment. One official adjusted his cuffs. Another tapped notes into a thin-screen tablet. "Recommendation?" the first asked. "Commendation," Thalen answered. "And integration of survival training protocols from Death Worlder origin planets, fire-based survival, friction ignition, psychological resilience under tech-null conditions." The board recorded his statement. Sarah, seated at the far end of the hall, said nothing. She didn't need to. Her hands were bandaged. Her name had already been included. By the time the shuttle returned her to the surface station days later, the story had begun to spread. Not loud, not viral. Quiet through crew networks and private comms. One sentence repeated: "She made fire." The training manual was updated a month later. A new section was added under Chapter 4, Non-Technological Survival in Electromagnetic Zones. It read 4.7, Friction-Based Combustion, Quinn Method. Primary Resourcefulness Technique. Recommended for Death Worlder-led missions or tech loss scenarios. Requires minimum 2 dry surfaces, sustained effort, and composure under duress. Field proven on Glaciron 4. And in the mess hall of the same research vessel, just beneath a viewport looking out over the glacier belt, a plaque was quietly installed with no ceremony. "Fire is not primitive. Forgetting it is. Lieutenant Sarah Quinn."